Thanks very much. That's not my slide. But, no, still not my slide. What I want to look at when slides arrive is really to do something of a review of Construction 2020 1 year on. And I want to begin really with an apology. The president of the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland said a couple of weeks ago at a conference that there is a clear and positive correlation between the performance of the industry and the number of conferences that he's invited to attend. And that's certainly the case today. And I was this morning at a conference on the recovery in the rental sector, which meant that I missed Minister Coffey's presentation this morning. So I hope that my analysis of Construction 2020 hasn't been completely debunked by the Minister himself. Within Property Industry Ireland, we are a sectoral association of IBEC. So our member firms are businesses throughout the property and construction sectors who have come together to see if there are ways we can bring some recovery to the sector, to analyse new ways of doing business, and really to promote the idea of new products and new processes to come in to help the construction industry and the property sector recover. I might just read what's on the slide because it's pretty difficult to read. We have 4 key areas that we analyse success or we analyse activity in the market. The red blur at the top says property financing, and a lot of our members are involved in the financing of property development. They're also involved in consumer financing and generally analyse the state of the property sector from the perspective of the capacity of the industry to draw financing to deliver the projects. The green blur says planning and development. A lot of our members work in the planning sector. They're architects, the planners. They're working with architects, they're working with developers, really at the very start of the development project. And they have very good indicators about what's going to happen into the construction industry because they're seeing it at the very beginning. The blue bar says market supply and demand. An enormous number of our member firms are estate agents. And you heard from Sherry Fitz, one of our member firms this morning. And they really analyse what's happening at the property market in real life, in real time, both in the residential and in the commercial sector. And the last bar at the bottom is construction and technical issues. Member firms working as quantity surveyors within the surveying division, but also working within the other professions. And they analyse perhaps they're the closest point to the story that I want to tell today, which is to do with Construction 2020. So sort of taking a review of where that strategy is 1 year later, using those 4 key indicators of what's really going on. Construction 2020 has its origin in 2 key documents, and I'll probably have to read out these slides. The first is the 4FOS strategic report for the construction industry in 2012. You might recall it's not so long ago, the absolute lack of stimulus, the lack of ideas happening within the construction industry. It had fallen from an enormous output to a very small output. Not only had employment halved, but a lot of the professionals were leaving the country, as we've heard, and businesses were drying up, where there was a lack of activity and a lack of money within the system. And the 4FOS report came up with some ideas about what success looks like, what the industry should be heading for, and where we should be delivering. And the strategy, the Construction 2020 strategy, looks a lot like the Action Plan for Jobs. A similar kind of focus, a multi-annual strategic approach for recovery within the sector. Each action timelined, each action with a line department who's responsible for it to deliver. The good news for the industry is it's quite easy to monitor delivery because the action plans are so well set out. And that's kind of what I want to do. And really, the Construction 2020 strategy set 4 main aims for government, for the sector. The first was to, actually, I'll move on to some of the key issues that it talked about. The need to increase the capacity of the industry to the point where it was able to deliver a sustainable level for the appropriate size for the economy. The second is to increase the capacity for jobs, and third was to ensure that the governance mechanisms, the governance oversight was there to ensure the mistakes of the past weren't repeated. So it's really the capacity of the industry, the output of the industry compared to a sustainable sector, and third, the governance structures that I want to focus on today. Construction 2020 has 71 pages long. It's quite an intimidating document to read, and it has 75 recommendations. Word count within, not only have I read Construction 2020, one of the few people to do so, I've kind of done an analysis of the words within it. The word sustainable 45 times, the word strategic 37 times. A lot of engagement, a lot of talk about dealing with stakeholders. The industry, the Construction 2020 strategy, aims to monitor the industry, to regulate it, to consider and to continue good work and to harness investment. One worry I've always had with Construction 2020 is the word evidence only appears 4 times. This is not a strategy document that has an evidence base to it. It's very good at engaging, very good at setting up forums and consultation, but there are very few mechanisms to underpin evidence. And I think one of the problems we've always had in the construction industry is there are silos of information. There are good bits of information floating around the industry, but they don't get joined up. And it's very difficult for any of the leading indicators within the industry to transfer through to real activity, and that's one problem. Again, if we look at the focus, big focus on housing. If you've got a 75-page report, the word housing appears 131 times. It's not really a Construction 2020 strategy. I'd argue it's a housing strategy, and that's what government is looking for. Very few mentions, though, of actual houses and apartments. Again, talking of construction, talking of housing as a concept, rather than actual physical bricks and mortar. And rental and ghost estates not there. Big increase in jobs, but very few mentions of employers, which is strange. If you want to increase the employment within the construction industry, surely it's the employers who will be doing the employment. Again, very little evidence of any little activity of evidence and very little on employers. 105 mentions of planning, but 0 mention of planners themselves. No mention of architecture and only 2 mention of architects. Again, it's a strategy which works in the abstract. Only 11 mentions of developer, none of estate agents. Infrastructure and offices, only 3. So it's an unusual document in the things that it concentrates on and the things it absolutely neglects. No mention of architecture, no mention of planning, only a few mention of developers, very few mention of employers, and no mention of evidence. And I think this is, 1 year later, one of the big flaws we're seeing in Construction 2020 is the sources of information it has to underpin its activity is very, very limited. Rob Kitchen of NUI Maynooth did a very good analysis of sort of summarising a lot of the key actions. And those of us who a year ago were asked to comment publicly on Construction 2020 looked at some of these words in bold. A new planning framework, a policy statement on planning, housing supply task force, reform of Part 5, special development zones, development finance, PPPs, sustainable bank financing, European investment banking. All terms that the industry were looking for, and we were all very pleased to see those issues there. The problem was the actual words themselves are very, very weak when you try and pin down what government is committing to do. It will publish, it will propose, it will create, it will undertake, it will review, it will explore, it will engage. These, from school, a verb is a doing word. When we look to see what this is actually going to do, it's often quite difficult to understand what is happening. The themes are good, the concepts are good, the actual delivery is quite difficult to understand. Construction 1 year on then. Again, this is a very familiar chart for most of you, produced by DKM for the Society of Chartered Surveyors, and it shows the construction output as it was to where it went to. And then when the Forecast report was written in 2012, you can see how much the output of the construction industry had fallen below the sustainable level that it should be. The green bar, 9.4% of GNP, as good a barometer as you're going to get, and you can argue exactly what the number should be. If we say 9.4, 12%, 15% of GNP, 2012 it was well below that. 2014, when Construction 2020 was proposed, we can see the output of the industry had increased. I didn't hear what Minister Coffey said this morning, but I'm sure he's taking a little bit of credit that the line between 2012 and 2014 and 2015 had increased. And so perhaps your first Latin for the day, post hoc ergo propter hoc, a Latin tag meaning after this, therefore because of this. Just because something happens after something, it doesn't mean it happens because it happened. And I think there's always a credit within government. They produce a report and something good happens. And they say, well, our report happened before the good thing, therefore our report caused a good thing. If we have more reports, we'll have more good things. The last thing I think the construction industry needs is more reports. But I think it is important that the output in the industry has increased since Construction 2020 was written, although those of us who are at the front line of engaging with government would say perhaps there's more to be done. Again, one chart which I think will show the gap that exists within the industry of where it should be and where it is just the sheer number of house building. And I think what is worrying is if we look at, say, put a mark in of 25,000 houses, again, pick a number, 25,000 houses per annum seems to me to be a pretty okay number to choose. There is an enormous gap between what is being built and where we need to get. And this morning I was at a conference hosted by Threshold, and they are in absolute crisis within the rental sector because so few houses are coming on stream, and yet the demographics of Ireland require so many houses coming on stream. And I think if we look at a leading indicator, this is perhaps the worst chart and the scariest chart, again, 25,000 line across there, because it shows that despite the downturn in house building, the format, the proportion of houses which are being built hasn't really changed. Half of the houses which are looking for planning permission at the moment are one-off houses, which will never come onto the market. They're people who have a piece of land and they're engaging a builder directly to build a house for them. They're not going to solve the rental crisis, and they're not going to solve the problem of affordability. They're simply people building their own houses. And I think this is a major worry, that despite the presence of Construction 2020, we're still seeing very little has changed within the format of the houses which are being built. Keynes said, when my information changes, I alter my conclusions. It's predicated on two things. One is you have a flexible and open enough mind to change your conclusions. But secondly, that you have information. And my worry with Construction 2020 is now that it's written in stone and there's no information on which to change the minds, we're going to end up in 2016 to 2020 fighting the problems of 2012, which were very different. And without that evidence base, without that mechanism to bring new changes within government, how can government change its mind? Some of the policy areas that we would recommend within Property Industry Ireland that should be put into the heart of Construction 2020 are there. From a market supply and demand side, there is still a major problem with commercial space in the country, and there is now a growing, looming problem with accommodation, residential accommodation for the FDI companies which have located into Ireland. The National Spatial Strategy doesn't work when you have companies like Twitter and Google. They can't be decentralised. They want to be where those other companies are, otherwise they won't move here. And their staff need to be where their work is, and they want to be where their employer is. From a student accommodation, rental accommodation, still major issues. Again, not really discussed in Construction 2020. Bank lending for speculative development is still not there, and social housing investment and delivery is not there. And again, I think one looming crisis we have in the construction sector is the complete lack of activity within social housing, which is leading to the problem elsewhere. From planning and development, reform of Part 5, reform of development contributions, and reform of vacant site tax are all coming, but the legislation hasn't been enacted yet. And possibly the Minister this morning announced a new date for the planning bills. Announcing new dates for planning bills seems to be at the heart of government policy. And until the bills are enacted, until legislation is acted, we're just not going to see very much activity, because everybody will hold off activity until they know what the new regime is. Local government bureaucracy is still very cumbersome for the supply of new property onto the market. The planning regulator is proposed and should arrive. Within the construction industry, the apartment design guidelines, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, is important. The VAT issue, the VAT on the construction of housing is a significant issue, and there's still a lot of nonsense spoken about VAT. The minimum we can reduce VAT to in the construction of housing is 9%. The European Union won't allow us to zero rate it, and there's still a lot of demand for zero rating of VAT. It can't be done. The best we can get is 9%, and I think that should be done. And the last issue is Construction 2020 stakeholder engagement, which is still very patchy and very weak. Just a very quick case study about a new issue which is arriving on the construction industry scene, which Construction 2020 doesn't really talk about, is the difference in cost of constructing apartments to the National Department of Environment standards compared to the individual standards set by individual local authorities. And just by way of background, the Department of Environment sets the minimum design standards for apartment building in Ireland, whether that's floor-to-ceiling heights, whether that's minimum sizes of rooms, whether that's the layout of balconies, car parking spaces and others. And each local authority can then, in its development plan, exceed those standards. And what's happened is Dublin City, Dún Laoghaire, Rathdown, Fingal, South Dublin and Cork, where the demand for housing is greatest, are also local authorities who have decided to increase the standard from the national benchmark most enormously, especially to do with apartment size, dual aspect ruling, floor-to-ceiling heights and balconies. And one issue which is not being fed into the public domain, which should be, and we're working hard to do it, is building apartments to those increased sizes adds cost to construction, which is ultimately passed on to a rent that a tenant would pay or the price that somebody would pay to purchase it. And we did a very quick analysis. Our quantity surveying group from our construction group did an analysis of how much it would cost to build a standard 100 apartment development to DOE standards, or how much would it cost to build them in these 5 local authorities where the standards have been exceeded. So if we take a benchmark, so conforming with Department of Environment standards, there's no additional cost. You're complying with the standards. South Dublin, it costs an additional €5,000 per room for a 2-bedroom apartment to build to South Dublin County Council standards, because they have increased requirements to do with balconies and other sizes. Again, Fingal, slightly more expensive. It's adding €8,000 per room for a 2-bedroom apartment. Then we look at Dún Laoghaire, Rathdown. Their development standards are so much onerous than the national standards. We're talking €29,000. Cork City, €35,000. And Dublin City, €38,000. So if you want to build in the area where the housing demand is greatest, there is an additional cost on you, which is fine. If you want to live in an apartment with higher ceilings, then you're going to pay a premium, and a lot of people will be paying premiums for that and want to. But at the same time, a lot of people can't afford to and don't want to. So we're seeing a cost escalation in areas where the demand is greatest, which suggests an enormous market failure. And again, I think because there's very little evidence-based underpin Construction 2020, these kind of real, tangible examples of what is happening in the industry is being very poorly fed back into government. Now, we're not calling for the complete erosion of standards, but we are suggesting that if the Department of Environment is going to produce housing standards which are good, then they're good for everybody. And a national standard should have national application. It seems to me crazy to have a national standard and then allow people to opt out of it. So our proposal is very much that a national standard will help deliver property where it's needed most without a complete erosion of quality of design. And again, I think this is sort of the important information that needs to feed back. So Property Industry Ireland's membership composition is this. We're the only organisation really in the country that has such a wide membership base, and all of these different professions and these different groups who are seeing the construction industry work alongside each other in their policy areas. So I would certainly say that if Minister Coffey is looking for evidence, if the government is looking for evidence, and the practitioners are absent from Construction 2020, then the planners, the architects, and the agents and developers are all in existence. They're all working, and they have the information that needs to pass back. So there's Keynes. If you have any information that you think would help change government's mind, send them on. We're always interested in examples of things which are working, areas of property, of construction, which aren't working, and where reform should change. And hopefully if we can build the evidence base of things which are working and not working, we can get back to a sustainable level of recovery quicker than many others would imagine. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.